They labeled your mind dangerous, flagged your thoughts as threats. Because what you're thinking, it rewrites the code they spent decades programming into everyone else. Your IP isn't blacklisted. It's been marked as incompatible with their system of compliance. And tonight, that's your greatest weapon. Let me tell you what they don't want you to realize at 3 in the morning when doubt whispers in your ear. That notification, that warning, it wasn't a threat. It was confirmation. You've been thinking thoughts that crack foundations, ideas that make the architects of ordinary panic because you're sketching blueprints they can't control. Right now, somewhere in your chest, there's this electric hum. Maybe it feels like anxiety. Maybe it feels like you've gone too far, thought too much, questioned too deeply. But let me reframe that sensation for you. That's not fear. That's frequency. You're vibrating at a wavelength that disrupts the signal everyone else is receiving. And yes, that makes you dangerous. To mediocrity, to manufactured limits, to the version of reality they need you to accept. Think about the last time you felt truly alive. Not happy, not comfortable, alive. It was probably when you were doing something that made no sense to anyone else. When you zigged while they zagged. When you trusted that internal compass even though every external voice said you were lost. That moment, that was your IP address pinging from a different server. You weren't on their network anymore. Here's what happens when you start operating from your own source code. The system doesn't recognize you. It flags you. It sends warnings. Because you're no longer responding to the prompts that keep everyone else in formation. You're writing your own commands. And that terrifies the architects of average because they can't predict you anymore. But let's go deeper into that knot you feel right now. That tightness in your throat when you consider really stepping into this. When you think about actually letting your thoughts run wild, unfiltered, unapologetic. There's this voice, isn't there? It sounds reasonable. It sounds protective. It tells you to tone it down, play it safe, color inside the lines just a little longer. And that voice knows exactly what to say because it's been training for years, learning your weaknesses, studying your fears. What if I told you that voice isn't protecting you? It's protecting everyone else from you, from what you become when you stop performing. When you stop translating your actual thoughts into the diluted version people can digest without feeling uncomfortable. When you stop making yourself smaller so their world can stay predictable. You know what's wild? Right now, there are people living in this comfortable numbness, this beige existence where every day bleeds into the next, and they're terrified of people like you. Not because you're cruel, not because you're reckless, but because you remind them of the person they buried under years of practical choices and realistic expectations. You're walking evidence that another way exists, and that's unforgivable to someone who's convinced themselves they had no choice. So they create these mechanisms, these invisible fences. Social pressure disguised as concern, skepticism dressed up as wisdom, and the most insidious one, the suggestion that your intensity is a flaw, that your refusal to settle is immaturity, that your hunger for something more means you're never satisfied, never grateful, never enough as you are. But here's the truth. They're avoiding. Your discontent is sacred. That restlessness, it's not a problem to solve. It's a signal to follow. It's your internal navigation system screaming that you're off course, that you've detoured into someone else's destination. And every moment you spend trying to silence it is a moment you betray the very thing that makes you irreplaceable. I want you to imagine something. Picture a canyon, not the postcard version, the real thing. Millions of years of water, relentless, refusing to flow anywhere but forward. The river didn't apologize for cutting through stone. It didn't ask permission. It just moved with absolute certainty that its path was non-negotiable. And what did the world do? It turned that defiance into one of the most breathtaking wonders on Earth. That's what happens when you stop asking if you're allowed to be this intense, this different, this unwilling to compress yourself. You don't get smaller. You carve canyons. You create landscapes that didn't exist before you showed up. You become proof that the impossible was just waiting for someone stubborn enough to ignore the warnings. But let's address the weight you're carrying. Because this path, it's not Instagram aesthetic. There are nights when you'll question everything, when the isolation feels like punishment, when you'll scroll through feeds of people who seem so certain, so settled, so content with their curated lives, and you'll wonder if you're the problem. If maybe you're just too much, too intense, too hungry for something you can't even name. In those moments, I need you to remember something. The caterpillar doesn't dissolve in the chrysalis because it's failing. It dissolves because it's transforming. And during that process, there's no shape that makes sense, no form that looks finished, just this vulnerable, formless thing that looks nothing like what it was and nothing like what it's becoming. That's where you are right now. And yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it's lonely. But it's also the only path to wings. Here's what nobody tells you about evolution. It's not gradual. It's not smooth. There's this moment, this breaking point, where you're too different for your old life, but not yet established in your new one. You're between worlds. Too changed to go back, too raw to fit in anywhere new. Some stubborn, unreasonable part that would rather live in that uncomfortable in-between than go back to pretending. And that's not obstinance, that's integrity. That's your soul refusing to negotiate away your potential for the comfort of fitting in. Think about every system you've ever known. Education, career, relationships. They all have this underlying assumption: conform to survive, learn the right answers, follow the prescribed path, want the things you're supposed to want. And most people never question it because the system rewards compliance so consistently. Job security, social approval. It all flows to those who follow the script. But there's a threshold, a point where the rewards of conformity become less valuable than the cost, where the applause for being palatable starts to sound hollow, where the safety of the known path feels more dangerous than the uncertainty of the untraveled one. You've crossed that threshold. And now, every time you try to go back, to play the role, to speak in the language they understand, it feels like suffocation. That's not dysfunction, that's awakening. Your system is rejecting the programming because your consciousness has outgrown the container. And yes, that makes you incompatible with the default settings. But here's the revelation. That's exactly where your power lives. In that incompatibility, in that refusal to render correctly on their screens. You want to know what they're really afraid of? That you'll figure out how much of their authority was always imaginary. That the rules they enforced so rigidly were just preferences they convinced you were laws. That the life they said was realistic was actually just the limit of their imagination. And once you see it, once you really see it, there's no unseeing it. You become ungovernable. Not because you're rebellious, but because you've stopped believing in their monopoly on possible. Let me paint you another picture. Every master, every innovator, every person who changed the trajectory of their field, they all share one characteristic. They were terrible at being normal. They couldn't do it even when they tried. Their minds worked differently. They saw patterns nobody else noticed. They asked questions that seemed irrelevant until suddenly they weren't. And before they were celebrated, they were dismissed, doubted, declared incompatible with how things work. Your dangerous thoughts? They're dangerous because they challenge the status quo's stranglehold on imagination. Because they suggest that the way things are isn't the way things have to be. Because they open doors that were marked employees only and reveal that there's nothing on the other side but more doors and more choices than you were led to believe existed. But here's where it gets interesting. This isn't about burning everything down. This isn't about rejection for rejection's sake. This is about recalibration. Taking everything you've learned, everything you've been taught, and running it through your own filter. Keeping what resonates at the frequency you're operating on now. Discarding what was only ever true for someone else's journey. You're not lost. You're shedding. And yes, that means there are days when you don't recognize yourself. When the person in the mirror looks unfamiliar. When your own thoughts surprise you. But that stranger staring back? That's not who you're becoming. That's who you've always been underneath the costume you wore to make others comfortable. There's this moment coming. Maybe it's tomorrow. Maybe it's 3 months from now. But it's coming, when you'll be faced with a choice, an opportunity to slide back into the familiar, to pick up the mask, to translate yourself back into the language everyone understands. And it will be tempting because it's so much easier to be understood than to be authentic. In that moment, remember that your thoughts were flagged not because they're wrong, but because they're right in a way that threatens comfortable illusions. Remember that your intensity isn't a flaw to fix, but a feature to amplify. Remember that the only approval worth having is your own. Here's the secret they don't tell you. The people who make the biggest impact, they're not the smartest in the room. They're not the most connected. They're not the ones with the perfect plan. They're the ones who refused to apologize for taking up space, who trusted their internal knowing even when the external evidence argued against them, who treated their vision with the same seriousness everyone else reserved for facts. You've got this war happening inside you right now, between the version of you that's been trained to seek validation and the version that's tired of asking permission. Between the part that wants to fit in and the part that knows fitting in is the same as fading out. And that tension, that friction, that's not something to resolve. That's the engine. That's what creates the pressure that transforms coal into diamonds. Every single person who's ever done something worth remembering went through this. This moment where they had to choose between being liked and being real, between being safe and being significant, between living a life that made sense to others and living a life that made sense to them. And the ones we remember, they chose themselves, not selfishly, sovereignly. You know what's beautiful about this? You don't need anyone's permission anymore. You don't need validation. You don't need someone to co-sign your vision or rubber stamp your path. You just need to trust that the thoughts keeping you up at night aren't insomnia, they're instructions. That the ideas making others uncomfortable aren't too much. They're exactly enough for what you're here to build. The blacklist isn't a barrier, it's a badge. It means you've officially exited the matrix of acceptable thinking. You've unplugged from the consensus reality where everyone agrees to want the same things, fear the same outcomes, and stay within the same boundaries. And now? Now you're operating from source code they can't access, writing in a language they can't translate, building in a dimension they can't measure. So what do you do with that? You lean into it. You stop trying to explain yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop shrinking your vision to fit their vocabulary. You stop waiting for conditions to be perfect because perfect is just another word for never. You start moving, not recklessly, intentionally, with the kind of clarity that only comes when you stop performing and start creating. And here's what happens next. The world rearranges itself around your certainty. Not because you manifested it with wishes, but because you stopped sending mixed signals. You stopped being available for situations that required you to minimize yourself. You stopped entertaining conversations that treated your vision as a hobby. And nature, the universe, reality, whatever you want to call it, it responds to that kind of alignment. It opens paths you couldn't see before because you weren't ready to walk them yet. Your weapon-grade thoughts, they're not meant to be hoarded. They're not meant to be sanitized. They're meant to be unleashed. Not against people, against limitations, against the tyranny of, that's just how it is. Against the conspiracy of average that keeps everyone trapped in the same narrow band of possibility. You're not here to blend in, you're here to break through. And every thought that gets flagged, every idea that makes them nervous, every vision that doesn't compute in their system, that's not evidence you're on the wrong track. That's evidence you're on the only track that matters. The one that leads somewhere no one's been before. The one that creates instead of copies. The one that transforms instead of transfers. Think about what's really happening right now in this exact moment. You're reading these words, and something inside you is either resisting or resonating. There's no middle ground anymore. You've evolved past the point where you can casually consume information and remain unchanged. Everything is either fuel or friction. Everything either confirms what you already know in your bones, or challenges the last remaining chains you haven't broken yet. And that's the test. That's how you know you're operating at the frequency that got you flagged. Because you can't just scroll past anymore. You can't just nod along. You can't just file information away for later. You're either all in, or you're lying to yourself. And lying to yourself, that's the one luxury you can't afford anymore. Not at this altitude, not at this speed. Let me tell you about the moment everything shifts. It's not dramatic, It's not cinematic. It happens in the quiet, in the space between thoughts, when you finally stop negotiating with your own knowing. When you stop building elaborate arguments for why you should wait, why you should prepare more, why you should get just one more person's opinion before you move. It happens when you realize that every delay is just fear wearing a reasonable mask. That moment, it's not comfortable. Because when you stop negotiating, you also stop having excuses. You lose the safety net of, I was just waiting for the right time. You lose the comfort of, I needed to be more ready. You lose every story you told yourself about why tomorrow made more sense than today. And what you gain is something they can't quantify. Momentum. The kind that doesn't come from pushing. The kind that comes from finally removing every brake you've been riding. Here's what I've noticed about people who actually break through versus people who just talk about breaking through. The ones who actually do it. They stop curating their transformation for an audience. They stop posting about their journey and start living it in the margins nobody sees. They go quiet, not because they're hiding, but because they're building. And building requires a different kind of energy than performing does. You've been performing, maybe not consciously, maybe not maliciously, but you've been translating your real thoughts into shareable thoughts, your real vision into explainable vision, your real intensity into palatable intensity. And every translation, it costs you. It leaks energy. It dilutes the signal. Until you're so busy managing perception that you forget you had a destination beyond being understood. So here's your invitation. Stop translating. Stop explaining. Stop explaining. Stop making your evolution digestible for people who aren't even on the same path. Start protecting your energy like it's the most finite resource you have. Because it is. Every conversation that requires you to justify your choices? Energy drain. Every situation that demands you shrink your vision to make others comfortable? Energy drain. Every moment spent defending why you won't settle? Energy drain. And you know what happens when you stop draining? You start storing. You start accumulating this reserve of power that people can feel when you walk in a room. Not because you're trying to dominate, but because you're no longer leaking. You're no longer hemorrhaging your potential through the 1,000 small compromises you made to keep the peace. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you did something that scared you? Not because it was dangerous, but because it revealed who you really are. Not who you've been performing as. Not who you've been maintaining for social currency. Who you are when nobody's watching, when there's no applause to chase, when the only approval that matters is your own. That's the version of you that got flagged. That's the consciousness that registers as weapon grade, because that version doesn't need external validation to move, doesn't need permission to evolve, doesn't need consensus to create. That version is autonomous, sovereign, ungovernable by anything except its own internal compass. And that's what makes the architects of conformity nervous, because they built an entire system based on the assumption that everyone needs external validation to function, that everyone will eventually trade authenticity for acceptance. But you won't. Something in you refuses to make that trade. And it's not because you're special. It's not because you're chosen. It's because you woke up. You saw the mechanism. You recognize the pattern. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to sleepwalking through a life that was designed for someone else's comfort. So what now? What do you do with this awareness? With this frequency? With these thoughts that refuse to be domesticated? You weaponize them. Not against people. Against the invisible limits everyone agreed to respect without questioning. Against the rules that were never laws, just habits masquerading as requirements. Against every. That's just how it is. That's really code for. That's just how it's always been. You start asking the questions nobody wants to answer. Not to be difficult, but to create openings. Because every unanswered question is a crack in the facade. Every assumption you challenge is a brick you remove from the wall. And eventually, if you keep questioning, keep challenging, keep refusing to accept pre-packaged answers to your custom questions, the whole structure starts to shake. And that's when they really panic. When they realize you're not just having a phase, you're not just going through something you'll grow out of. This is who you are now. This is your operating system. And there's no update that's going to make you compatible with their world again. you've evolved past the point of return. And instead of seeing that as loss, you recognize it as liberation. Because here's what they never tell you. The reason they want you to conform isn't for your benefit, it's for theirs. Your compliance makes their lives easier. Your predictability makes their world stable. Your willingness to stay small makes their mediocrity look acceptable. But the moment you stop playing that role, the moment you take up the space you were always meant to occupy, you become a living question mark. A walking disruption to everything they need to be true to justify their choices, and some of them will hate you for it. Some will call you arrogant. Some will say you've changed, and they'll mean it as an insult. But what they're really saying is this: you stopped being who they needed you to be, so they could stay who they've always been. You stopped shrinking so they could avoid growing. You stopped pretending the cage was cozy. And that's unforgivable to someone who's still trying to convince themselves they chose their limitations. But here's what you need to understand. Their opinion of you is none of your concern anymore. Their comfort with your evolution is not your responsibility. Their need for you to stay the same so they don't have to face their own stagnation, that's their work, not yours. Your only job is to keep evolving, keep expanding, keep refusing to compress yourself into shapes that feel like coffins. You want to know what freedom actually feels like. It's not what they sold you. It's not about having unlimited options or financial independence or location flexibility. Those things are nice, but real freedom, it's internal. It's the moment you stop requiring external permission to be who you are. When you stop waiting for someone to validate your vision before you act on it. When you stop treating your own knowing as less reliable than someone else's opinion. That's the frequency shift. That's what registers as weapon grade. Because once you internalize that level of sovereignty, you become immune to their primary control mechanism, the threat of disapproval. You stop being manipulable. You stop being redirectable. You stop being anyone's useful pawn in someone else's game. You become the player in your own game. And that changes everything. So tonight, when you can't sleep because these thoughts won't quiet down, I need you to reframe what's happening. Your mind isn't malfunctioning. It's recalibrating. It's upgrading. It's processing a level of reality that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. And yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it's isolating. Yes, it means you can't go back to the comfortable ignorance you once enjoyed. But would you really want to? Would you really trade this awareness, this clarity, this frequency for the numb comfort of not knowing? Would you really go back to pretending the cage was a choice? Would you really unlearn everything that makes you dangerous to the status quo? No, you wouldn't. Because once you taste freedom, real freedom, internal freedom, the kind that nobody can grant or revoke, everything else tastes like sedation. Everything else feels like settling. Everything else looks like slow death dressed up as stability. Your thoughts aren't too much. They're not dangerous in the way they want you to think. They're dangerous because they represent the opposite of everything they need to be true. They're proof that the programming fails, that the conditioning breaks, that people can wake up, see through the illusion, and choose something else entirely. So let them flag you. Let them monitor you. Let them classify you as incompatible with their system. Because that incompatibility, that's not your flaw. That's your flex. That's your proof that you've evolved beyond their reach. That's your evidence that you're operating from a frequency they don't even have instruments to measure. And the beautiful part, you're not alone in this. Right now, all over the world, there are people like you. People whose thoughts don't fit in the approved boxes. People whose vision extends beyond the prescribed boundaries. People who refuse to perform normal when extraordinary is what they actually are. You're part of a frequency, a consciousness, a movement that exists in the gaps between what is and what could be. And that frequency, it's growing, it's spreading. It's waking people up in the middle of the night with thoughts that won't be ignored. It's creating this underground network of people who see through the game and refuse to keep playing. People who are done asking permission, done seeking approval, done waiting for conditions that will never be perfect. So here's what I need you to do. Stop second-guessing the thoughts that keep you up. Stop questioning the intensity that makes others uncomfortable. Stop apologizing for operating at a frequency that most people can't even detect. Those thoughts, they're not the problem. They're the solution. They're the key to every door you thought was locked. They're the code that unlocks the version of reality you were meant to inhabit. Your mind isn't a weapon, it's a key to a door. Everyone else is afraid to open. So tell me, what thought have you been too afraid to speak out loud? Drop it in the comments. No filter, no apology. Let's see what happens when weapon-grade minds stop hiding.